In the summer of 1980, three close friends, Mark, Joey, and the narrator, decided to go on a camping trip to break free from the monotony of their daily lives. Mark had been unhappy with his soul-crushing desk job at an insurance company for weeks, while Joey and the narrator weren't faring much better either. The narrator was stuck in a cycle of temporary jobs, and Joey was working long hours at a warehouse for minimum wage. They were desperate to escape the stresses of work and the daily grind, but with limited funds and no time for an extravagant road trip, they settled on the idea of going camping. After some discussion, they decided that the Harold Parker State Forest would be the ideal destination. It was just an hour's drive north of Cambridge, close enough to feel convenient, but large enough to make it feel like a true wilderness adventure. Harold Parker State Forest, with its vast expanse of over 3,000 acres of pine and oak trees, seemed like the perfect spot to escape the narrator. Mark and Joey had been there once before years earlier on a day trip, so they knew the forest well enough to plan a three-night stay. They chose early fall for their trip, hoping the weather would be cool but not too cold or wet. The planning process was simple. They pooled their resources to keep costs down. Mark's rusty old blue hatchback was barely roadworthy, but it was good enough for the trip. Mark also dug out his dad's ancient two-man tent, which, though old and patched up, was still functional. Bowie, who had a smaller, cheaper one-person tent, brought it along as well. They split up the rest of the gear: sleeping bags, a cooler, a few cooking tools, a fishing rod from Joey, and some tarps in case it rained. The drive to the forest was a lot of fun. They left on a Friday afternoon with the sun still high in the sky, blasting rock music on the car stereo. The journey was filled with excitement, and as they approached the park, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over everything. They arrived at the gravel parking lot near the entrance, where only one other car was parked. After paying a few dollars at the self-service kiosk, they picked a campsite near a place called Berry Pond, a flat clearing surrounded by tall trees. A fire ring had already been set up, and the ground was covered in pine needles. Through the trees, they could see the shimmering water of the pond, reflecting the last light of the setting sun. The place was beautiful, peaceful, and serene. That first night was everything they hoped for. Mark quickly got a fire going with a lighter and some crumpled newspaper he had brought along. The group cooked hot dogs over the flames, and the narrator found an old dented pot in his mom's basement to heat up some beans. Though the food wasn't gourmet, it tasted better than expected. They cracked open some beers and sat around the fire, leaning on a log they had dragged over. The warm firelight, the crackling sounds of burning wood, and the cool air made everything feel perfect. As the narrator stared into the flames, he felt the stress of his everyday life melting away, thinking to himself, "This is exactly what I needed." The next day, they decided to explore the area, choosing a 3-mile trail that looped around the pond and led to an overlook. The trail was narrow, winding through the woods, and the sounds of rustling leaves and small animals darting through the underbrush filled the air. At the overlook, they paused to take in the view, the vast wild forest stretching out before them in the morning sun. It was beautiful, and they all felt a deep sense of peace. The forest, though untamed and wild, made them feel safe and secure, unaware of the danger that was silently lurking just beyond their awareness. The peaceful start to their trip would soon take a dark turn, changing everything they thought they knew about the forest and their friendship. As the trip continued, the group of friends, Mark, Joey, and the narrator, began to immerse themselves fully in the camping experience, feeling the rejuvenating effects of the wilderness. After spending the first night in the forest, the next day began with a sense of excitement and adventure. They had set out to explore, choosing a 3-mile trail that looped around the pond and climbed up to an overlook. The path was narrow and shaded by the dense canopy of trees, and the sounds of rustling leaves and wildlife scurrying through the underbrush filled the air, making them feel even more connected to nature. The trail was peaceful, and they moved at a leisurely pace, soaking in the beauty of the forest. They passed around a bag of trail mix and chatted lightly, their conversation blending seamlessly with the natural sounds around them. When they reached the overlook, the view was spectacular. The forest stretched out before them, an unbroken sea of green trees bathed in the soft light of the morning sun. The sight was so beautiful, so serene, that they all sat down for a while, taking it all in. They were quiet for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts, before the narrator reflected on how peaceful everything was. The wilderness felt vast, untamed, and wild, yet they felt safe and at ease within its embrace. It was a rare and precious feeling, a feeling of being so far removed from the pressures of daily life that all worries seemed to evaporate. It was exactly what they had needed, a break from the grind of work and the stress of everyday life. Later that afternoon, they hiked a longer trail, which further solidified the sense of freedom they were experiencing. They were away from the noise of the world, deeply immersed in nature's rhythm. As the sun began to set, they returned to camp exhausted but satisfied by the day's adventure. Mark, as expected, quickly fell asleep in the tent, while the narrator took on the task of gathering more wood for the fire. They had been hiking for hours, and it was clear that they were all physically drained, so they decided to rest early. The peacefulness of the forest settled around them, and they all settled into their tents looking forward to a good night's sleep. However, what seemed like a simple, peaceful camping experience soon took a dark turn as the narrator lay in his sleeping bag. The quiet of the forest began to feel unsettling. Mark had already fallen asleep beside him, his steady breathing filling the silence. But around 4:30 a.m., the narrator woke up feeling cold, and he immediately sensed that something wasn't quite right. The air inside the tent felt damp and the flap was unzipped. Mark's sleeping bag was empty and his boots were missing, though his jacket was still crumpled in the corner of the tent. The narrator tried to dismiss his unease, assuming Mark had gone out to relieve himself, but as time passed with no sign of him returning, the unease grew into something deeper, something unsettling that couldn't be explained away so easily. After waiting for what felt like an eternity, the narrator's growing concern forced him to get up and look outside. The forest was pitch black, and the beam of his flashlight barely cut through the darkness. He called out Mark's name, but there was no response. At this point, he was no longer able to convince himself that Mark was just off somewhere. As he moved further away from the campsite, he began to feel that something was terribly wrong. The narrator's panic mounted, and he called out for Joey, waking him from his own tent. They began searching the campsite and then moved deeper into the woods, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The sense of isolation was suffocating, and the narrator couldn't shake the thought that something dangerous was at play. What had started as a fun adventure now felt eerily like a nightmare, and the friendly forest they had once felt so comfortable in suddenly became an uninviting and terrifying place. As the search for Mark continued through the night, the atmosphere grew more tense and ominous, setting the stage for the horrors that would unfold. The narrator and Joey moved further into the woods, calling out Mark's name in hopes of finding him, but with no luck. The forest, which had once seemed peaceful and serene, now felt suffocating and endless, as if the very trees were conspiring to keep them lost. The narrator's flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, scanning the ground and trees for any sign of their friend. But there was nothing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt of anxiety through them. They had no idea where Mark had gone, and the eerie silence of the woods only made things worse. The deepening darkness made it nearly impossible to see clearly, but they pressed on, trying to cover as much ground as they could. The forest was thick, the terrain rough with roots underfoot, threatening to trip them as they stumbled through the night. Despite their growing fear, they knew they had to keep searching. The minutes felt like hours, and their sense of dread grew with each passing moment. The once quiet and peaceful wilderness now felt like an alien, hostile world. What had begun as a fun camping trip had spiraled into a desperate search for a friend who seemed to have vanished without a trace. Then, after what felt like an eternity of fruitless searching, Joey suddenly stopped. His flashlight swung towards something on the ground, and the narrator's heart sank when he saw what it was. Mark's faded blue hat snagged on a bush. The discovery stopped them both in their tracks. They stared at the hat for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. It didn't make sense. Why would Mark have left his hat behind in the middle of the woods? Was he in some sort of danger? Was something wrong? As they examined the scene further, their fears deepened. They continued to search and soon found Mark's socks discarded one by one, his jeans crumpled and left behind as if he had shed them on purpose. Then his t-shirt and boxers appeared scattered over a stretch of ground, all in a deliberate, unsettling path. The more they found, the more it became clear that Mark hadn't simply gone for a walk or gotten lost. Something was terribly wrong. Joey, trying to make sense of it all, asked if Mark had been drinking or using something stronger. The group had drunk all the beer they had on the first night, but it seemed impossible that Mark had been drunk enough to strip off his clothes and wander into the woods in the dead of night. The scenario didn't fit Mark's personality at all. He wasn't the type to act recklessly, especially not in such a dangerous situation. Joey's thoughts turned to other explanations, but none of them felt right. They continued their search, shouting for Mark, but their voices only echoed back in the silence. The tension between them was palpable, the fear now visible on their faces. After a while, the search led them deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, and the path became more difficult to navigate. The night had taken on a strange, unnerving quality. The flashlight beams cast long, stretching shadows, and the thick underbrush made it even harder to move. Their feet were wet, their hands cold as they clutched the flashlights, and the forest felt vast, seemingly infinite. But just as the exhaustion was starting to take its toll, they found it the thing that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lying on the ground, cold and lifeless, was Mark's decapitated body. The sight of it froze the narrator in place, unable to move or speak. The body was pale and untouched, the skin almost glowing under the flashlight's beam, with no visible marks or wounds. The blood around the neck wound had congealed and soaked into the ground. The cut clean and straight, the body's unnatural stillness, coupled with the horror of its condition, made the scene feel more like a nightmare than reality. The narrator, unable to process what he was seeing, felt his mind disconnect for a moment, as though he were witnessing a movie prop rather than the reality of his friend's death. The shock was so intense he couldn't believe his eyes. Joey's reaction was even more intense. He refused to accept that it was Mark calling out his name over and over, hoping that somehow he would hear his voice and come back to them. But the more they looked at the body, the clearer it became. This was Mark. His height, build, and even his clothing confirmed it. The realization hit hard, and the deep pain of losing a friend in such a tragic and horrifying way overwhelmed them both. Joey finally broke down, his sobs filled with denial and grief. The narrator stood there frozen, unable to comfort him, knowing that nothing could make sense of what they had just discovered. The realization set in their friend was gone, and he would never come back. With shaking hands, the narrator tried to console Joey, but the shock of the situation was too great. They both knew they had to do something. But what? There was nothing they could do now except return to camp and report what they had found. They fled the woods as quickly as they could, their minds reeling from the horror they had just witnessed. The night would stay with them forever, and the terror of finding Mark's body in the woods would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The traumatic events of the night were far from over, and the nightmare for the narrator and Joey only deepened as they were forced to confront the reality of what had happened. After discovering Mark's decapitated body deep in the woods, the two friends rushed back to the campsite, their minds clouded with disbelief, fear, and confusion. Their once peaceful camping trip had now turned into a gruesome nightmare, and the weight of the situation was unbearable. As they reached their campsite, they were no longer able to shake the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in their bones. Every small sound, every movement in the trees only heightened their terror. In a state of shock, they tried to make sense of the horrifying discovery. The urgency to report what had happened pushed them into action. But every step felt surreal. Their first instinct was to drive back to the park ranger station, a desperate attempt to find help and answers. When they reached the ranger station, the two rangers on duty gave them a few cups of coffee, their faces showing no signs of sympathy, only a professional detachment. The rangers listened as Joey, trembling and struggling to speak, recounted what had occurred, while the narrator did his best to support him, offering any details that could explain the strange circumstances surrounding Mark's disappearance and death. But as they told their story, the rangers seemed unmoved, their expressions neutral, as if they had heard it all before. There was no comfort, no reassurance, just an unsettling sense that they were not being believed. The rangers took them back to the campsite at dawn where the body of Mark had been discovered. The area looked eerily untouched, with everything still in place, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The bodies of the two friends, still filled with disbelief, walked through the campsite in a haze. When they reached Mark's body, the ranger saw the gruesome scene, and though his jaw tightened with what seemed like restraint, he gave no verbal reaction. He only turned to the two friends and narrowed his eyes, asking what had happened. Joey, still shaking, managed to explain that they had no idea. He pointed out that they had just found Mark like this with no clues as to who or what had done it. The ranger took a long pause, studying them closely, and something in his eyes told the narrator that he wasn't convinced by their story. The situation took a more sinister turn as the ranger got on his radio and called for backup, speaking with a calm professionalism that barely masked the gravity of the situation. He informed the authorities that two witnesses had discovered a decapitated body and that they weren't allowed to leave until further questioning. The two friends were split up, each interrogated separately. The police arrived soon after, two cruisers flashing their lights silently as they approached the campsite. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and the already shaken friends were subjected to a relentless series of questions. Where had they been when it happened? What did they hear? Did Mark have any enemies? Did they have any idea who might have done this? The officers fired off their questions with no concern for their emotional state. There was no empathy, only suspicion. The Rangers and police treated them as suspects, and their tone made it clear that they believed the two were hiding something. After hours of questioning, the police took their clothes, their gear, and everything they had brought with them. Clothes, tents, sleeping bags, cooking utensils, and even the little knives they had used for food. The two friends were told that everything would be bagged as evidence, a reminder that they were not free to leave. Though they knew they had done nothing wrong, they felt trapped in a nightmare. They couldn't escape. The authorities, with their cold professionalism, made it clear that they were under suspicion. Neither Joey nor the narrator knew how to respond to the increasing doubts cast upon them, and both feared that they might be wrongly accused of something they didn't do. Eventually, the authorities took them to the precinct, separating them into different rooms for more questioning. The police officers and detectives went over the same questions again, probing deeper into their relationship with Mark and trying to find any motive that could explain the brutal murder. The detective, who had been very composed during the questioning, leaned in and asked if there had been any friction between the narrator and Mark. Had they fought, and had there been jealousy or any unresolved issues? The narrator denied everything forcefully, emphasizing that Mark and he were best friends, and there was no reason for any conflict between them. But the detective's persistence and the mounting pressure in the small gray room made him feel increasingly cornered. The constant questioning made him feel like a criminal, even though he knew he was innocent. Hours later, the two friends were released, though the suspicion surrounding them remained. The police had no weapon, no clear motive, and nothing to suggest they had anything to do with Mark's death. But there was still the matter of Mark's head. It was missing, and no one could explain where it had gone or why it had been taken. Despite the ongoing investigation, the case went cold. There were no answers, and the mystery remained unsolved. The horror of Mark's death haunted the narrator and Joey for months as they grappled with their trauma, unable to find peace. The police investigation had turned up no answers, and the case was eventually dropped, leaving the two friends to live with the horrifying memories of that weekend and the unresolved questions that lingered. The pain of losing Mark and the unanswered questions weighed heavily on both of them, and though time passed, they were never the same. Joey eventually moved away, starting a new life in Oregon, but the narrator stayed in Cambridge. He tried to move on, but he couldn't escape the nightmares that followed him. His life spiraled into a downward spiral of alcoholism, depression, and hopelessness as he struggled to cope with the memories of what happened that fateful weekend. His inability to move past the horror of Mark's death left a permanent scar on his soul. The case stayed cold. Mark was gone, and the mystery of his death would remain unsolved forever, haunting those who had been closest to him. The aftermath of the events in the woods continued to haunt both the narrator and Joey long after they had left the forest. Mark's brutal and unexplained death cast a dark shadow over their lives, and the impact of the traumatic experience would linger for months to come. Joey, unable to bear the weight of what had happened, eventually moved to Oregon, seeking a fresh start in a new place, away from the painful memories of that weekend. The narrator, on the other hand, stayed in Cambridge, but his life quickly unraveled. He couldn't escape the horrifying images of that night, the sight of Mark's decapitated body, the eerie silence of the forest, and the sense of dread that had filled the air as they searched for their friend. The memories haunted him, and he began to lose control of his life. At first, the narrator tried to function normally, but everything felt different. The once peaceful and predictable rhythms of life seemed out of reach. He couldn't focus on his job or personal life, and his mind would often wander back to the terrifying events in the woods. He couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. He had been there. He had seen what happened, but he couldn't stop it. His thoughts consumed him, and soon he found himself unable to hold down a steady job. Whether it was working as a temp or doing odd jobs, he couldn't focus or find any meaning in his day-to-day existence. Every time he tried to work, the memories of Mark's body and the chilling sense of fear would overwhelm him. It was as if his brain couldn't process the trauma, and it left him paralyzed, unable to function like he used to. The stress of living with these unresolved emotions led the narrator down a dark path. He turned to alcohol as a way to numb the pain, but it only made things worse. His drinking problems spiraled out of control, and his days became a blur of drunken stupors and restless nights. The nights in particular were the hardest. When he was sober, his mind would replay the haunting images of Mark's lifeless body lying in the woods. He would dream about Mark walking away from him through the trees, stripping off his clothes as he went. No matter how hard he tried to reach him, Mark would never hear him, and when he finally turned around, he would be headless. The nightmares left him waking in a cold sweat, his heart racing and his mind racing with questions. Why had it happened? What had caused Mark's death? And most haunting of all, who had taken his head? The more he tried to forget, the more the memories consumed him. His relationships with others began to deteriorate as well. The narrator's girlfriend stuck around for a while, trying to support him through the darkest times, but as his depression and drinking worsened, she eventually left. She couldn't deal with the emotional turmoil and the constant wall of silence he had built around himself. The narrator didn't blame her. He knew he had become a shell of the person he used to be. The trauma of that night had taken everything from him. His friends drifted away and he isolated himself further. He could no longer connect with anyone, not even his closest friends. The nightmares and the guilt felt like a constant weight pressing down on his chest. The breaking point came when the narrator hit rock bottom. His joblessness, his isolation, and his unhealthy coping mechanisms left him physically and mentally drained. He had stopped leaving the house, stopped eating, and even stopped caring about anything at all. He lost a significant amount of weight, and his health began to deteriorate. It was then that his sister intervened, dragging him to a doctor who prescribed medication to help him cope with his anxiety and depression. The pills dulled the sharp edges of his pain, but the nightmares remained. No matter how much he tried to push the memories down, they would always resurface, waiting to torment him in his sleep. In an effort to regain some semblance of normalcy, the narrator started therapy. His sister found a cognitive behavioral therapy program, one that was intensive but offered hope for recovery. He began attending sessions twice a week, hoping that he could face the trauma that had shattered his life. The therapists were understanding, never pushing too hard, but encouraging him to confront the deep wounds that still festered inside him. One therapist suggested that writing about his experiences might help him process his emotions and make sense of the chaos in his mind. The narrator took their advice, and over time the act of writing about what had happened, about Mark's death, the search in the woods, and the trauma that followed began to loosen the grip that the memories held over him. However, the process was slow. Even though it helped, the pain didn't fade quickly. The scars remained, and the narrator still carried the burden of Mark's death. Though the therapy helped him take small steps toward healing, the narrator would never fully be the same. The past would always be with him, a dark chapter that defined his life in ways he couldn't escape. He would always be haunted by the events that took place in that forest, by the eerie stillness of Mark's body, and by the unanswered questions that would forever linger in his mind. Mark was gone and the case had gone cold, but the narrator's pain was a constant reminder of the brutal reality that sometimes the answers we seek are never found. The aftermath of Mark's mysterious and brutal death continued to consume both the narrator and Joey. Despite the months that passed after the tragic events in the woods, the emotional toll was immense, and it was clear that neither of them would ever be the same again. Joey, unable to cope with the trauma of what had happened, made the decision to leave Cambridge. He moved to Oregon, hoping that a fresh start would help him escape the painful memories of that weekend. The narrator, on the other hand, stayed behind, but the experience had changed him in ways that were impossible to ignore. The intense grief and trauma that followed Mark's death left him lost in a fog of depression, and he found himself spiraling into a deep, uncontrollable darkness. As the narrator tried to keep going with his life, he realized that nothing seemed to work. He could no longer function at work or in his personal life. The memories of that night, of the search for Mark, of finding his decapitated body, and the horror of it all haunted him every day. No matter what he did, the trauma was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished, something he needed to know about what had really happened to Mark. The confusion and unanswered questions gnawed at him, and the weight of guilt and loss became unbearable. He couldn't even escape the memories when he tried to sleep, as the nightmares relentlessly replayed the gruesome scene of Mark's lifeless body in the woods. He would wake up in cold sweats, heart pounding, unable to make sense of the images in his mind, desperate to numb the pain. The narrator turned to alcohol. It seemed like the only way to escape the constant barrage of thoughts and feelings. But instead of providing relief, the alcohol only made things worse. It clouded his mind and made the pain more unbearable. His drinking problem spiraled out of control, and soon he was no longer able to hold down a job. The narrator bounced from one temp job to another, unable to focus, unable to care. His personal relationships deteriorated, and even his girlfriend, who had stuck by him through the hardest parts, eventually left. She couldn't deal with the emotional wall he had built around himself, nor could she handle the darkness that seemed to consume him. The narrator understood her decision, though. He had become someone unrecognizable, a person crippled by grief, guilt, and an inability to cope with the past. For months, the narrator continued to spiral. He would spend his days in a haze, alternating between drunken stupors and moments of intense clarity, where the pain and confusion seemed unbearable. He couldn't escape the thought that Mark's death was tied to something far darker than he could comprehend. What had happened in those woods? Why had Mark been taken from them in such a brutal and mysterious way? And why had his head never been found? These questions haunted the narrator, keeping him up at night and leaving him with a sense of incompleteness, as though the answers to these questions were the only way to bring some semblance of peace. Eventually, after months of isolation and self-destructive behavior, the narrator hit rock bottom. He stopped leaving the house, stopped eating, and lost a significant amount of weight. His mental and physical health deteriorated rapidly, and it became clear to his family that he needed help. His sister intervened and took him to a doctor who prescribed medication to help him cope with his depression and anxiety. Though the medication helped dull the sharp edges of his emotional pain, it did nothing to erase the nightmares or the deep sense of loss he felt. The past continued to haunt him, and no amount of medication or therapy seemed to fully alleviate the weight of what had happened. In an effort to regain some sense of control over his life, the narrator began attending therapy. His sister had found a cognitive behavioral therapy program that was intensive, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The therapist encouraged him to write about his experiences, to confront the trauma instead of burying it. This exercise in writing became an important step for the narrator, as it allowed him to confront the painful memories. Head-on, writing about the events about Mark's death and about the emotional chaos that followed was difficult, but it helped to process the overwhelming grief. Still, the journey to healing was long and slow. Though the therapy helped him make small strides, the pain of losing Mark and the mystery of his death would never truly leave him. The scars would remain, and the narrator realized that no matter how much he tried to move on, the past would always be a part of him. Though the investigation into Mark's death had gone cold and the case had never been solved, the narrator continued to grapple with the unanswered questions. He would always wonder what had really happened in the woods and whether they had somehow missed an important clue that could have led to the truth. But for now, he had to come to terms with the fact that some questions would never be answered and that the trauma of that weekend would remain with him forever. Even as he slowly began to rebuild his life, the shadow of that camping trip and the horror that came with it would always loom large in his mind. The trauma that followed the horrifying events in the woods continued to plague both the narrator and Joey, though time had passed since Mark's brutal and mysterious death. The aftermath of that fateful camping trip was far from over, and both friends struggled to come to terms with the horrific experience that would forever define their lives. The investigation into Mark's death went cold, and despite months of searching for answers, there was no resolution. Mark's head was never found, and the police had no clear leads, which left the friends in a state of confusion and grief. While Joey eventually moved out of state, seeking a fresh start in Oregon, the narrator stayed behind in Cambridge, unable to shake the events that had unfolded. The weight of the trauma bore heavily on him, and his life began to unravel in the months that followed. Though Joey's departure was an attempt to escape the pain, the narrator found himself unable to function. The trauma of losing his friend in such a brutal and senseless way left him emotionally and mentally paralyzed. He couldn't move on. The memories of Mark's disappearance, the frantic search through the woods, and the gruesome discovery of his decapitated body would never leave him. They haunted him daily, creeping into every corner of his mind. The nightmares were relentless visions of Mark's lifeless body, the blood-soaked ground, and the eerie silence of the woods replayed in his dreams, leaving him in a constant state of fear and anxiety. The deep emotional wounds he had suffered could not be healed easily. As the narrator struggled to cope with his emotional turmoil, he turned to alcohol as a way to numb the pain. His drinking problem quickly spiraled out of control, and soon he found himself unable to hold down a steady job. The jobs he did manage to get, temp work or menial tasks, were rendered meaningless by his constant battle with depression and grief. The emotional weight of what he had witnessed took a toll on every aspect of his life. He couldn't focus, couldn't connect with anyone, and his relationships began to suffer. Even his girlfriend, who had stuck by him through his darkest moments, eventually left him. She could no longer bear the emotional burden of being with someone who was so broken. The narrator, understanding her decision, found himself isolated and alone. He had become a shell of the person he once was, consumed by the haunting memories of the past. The downward spiral continued as the narrator became more withdrawn. He stopped leaving the house, stopped interacting with others, and even stopped eating. His health began to deteriorate, and it was clear to his family that something needed to change. His sister, seeing how far he had fallen, took him to a doctor who prescribed medication to help him cope with his depression and anxiety. While the medication helped dull the sharp edges of his pain, it did little to erase the nightmares or the deep sense of loss that lingered within him. The trauma of that weekend continued to loom over him, and the feelings of guilt and helplessness never truly left. It was as if he were permanently tethered to the past, unable to break free. In an attempt to regain some sense of normalcy, the narrator began attending therapy. His sister had found a cognitive behavioral therapy program that was intensive but offered some hope. The therapist suggested that writing about the events could help him process his emotions and confront the trauma head-on. The narrator began to write about Mark's death, the search for him, and the chilling discovery of his body. Writing about his feelings, though painful, allowed him to confront the raw emotions that he had been trying to bury. Slowly, the act of putting his thoughts and feelings on paper began to help him make sense of what had happened. However, it was a slow and difficult process. The pain didn't fade quickly, and there were still many nights where the nightmares returned, flooding his mind with images of Mark's body and the terror they had faced in the woods. Despite the therapy, the medications, and the writing, the narrator realized that he would never be the same person he was before that camping trip. Mark's death and the horrific events that followed had irreparably changed him. The narrator's journey toward healing was ongoing, but it was clear that some scars would never fully heal. The trauma of that night would always be a part of him, a dark chapter in his life that defined who he had become. The unanswered questions, who killed Mark, why his head was never found, and why he had to die in such a brutal manner, would never be answered. The narrator had learned to live with the uncertainty, but the weight of the past would never truly leave him. As the years passed, the narrator slowly started to rebuild his life, but he knew that the memory of Mark and the tragic events of that camping trip would always haunt him. The past had left an indelible mark on his soul, one that could not be erased. Though he tried to move forward, he understood that the scars of that weekend would always be with him, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when least expected. Months had passed since the horrific discovery of Mark's body, and the trauma continued to consume both the narrator and Joey in ways they hadn't anticipated. Mark's brutal death, which still remained unsolved, haunted them relentlessly. The forest, which had once been a place of adventure and camaraderie, was now a dark and terrifying reminder of their lost friend. The weight of the experience gradually became too much for Joey to bear. In an attempt to escape the painful memories, Joey decided to leave Cambridge and start fresh in Oregon. The move was a desperate effort to rebuild his life far away from the horrors that had defined his time in the woods. Though the physical distance between them grew, the emotional scars remained both for Joey and the narrator. The narrator, however, chose to stay behind. But the tragedy of Mark's death continued to gnaw at him, infecting every corner of his existence. His life, once full of promise, had begun to fall apart. The narrator could no longer function at work or even in his personal life. The unbearable grief paired with the guilt of not being able to protect Mark left him in a constant state of despair. His job as a temporary worker was a futile distraction from the pain that lurked just beneath the surface. The feeling of hopelessness grew more intense with each passing day. The once familiar routines of everyday life no longer seemed meaningful. His existence was clouded by one thought: the terror of what had happened to Mark. Unable to escape the emotional turmoil, the narrator turned to alcohol as a way to numb his pain. The bottle seemed like the only escape from the relentless mental and emotional anguish. As he sank deeper into his addiction, his relationships with others began to deteriorate. His girlfriend, who had stayed with him through the darkest of times, could no longer deal with the emotional wreckage he had become. Eventually, she left, unable to handle the emotional burden of living with someone who was so consumed by the past. The narrator understood her decision, though. The rejection added another layer to the pain he was already feeling. Alone in his grief, he retreated further into his isolation, unable to connect with anyone. With the absence of meaningful work or personal connections, the narrator found solace in his own self-destructive behavior. His drinking spiraled out of control and his physical and mental health deteriorated. He couldn't escape the haunting images of Mark's death, the decapitated body, the eerie stillness of the forest, and the nagging questions that refused to go away. How had Mark's life been taken in such a brutal and senseless way? Why was his head never found? These unanswered questions consumed the narrator's thoughts. He was trapped in a never-ending loop of grief and confusion, unable to make sense of what had happened. His mind kept returning to the night of Mark's death, replaying the search through the dark woods, the sickening discovery of Mark's body, and the overwhelming sense of dread that followed. Eventually, the narrator hit rock bottom. He stopped leaving the house altogether, stopped eating, and withdrew from everyone. His health took a dramatic turn for the worse, and it was clear to his family that he needed help. His sister, seeing the destruction his grief had caused, intervened and took him to see a doctor. The diagnosis was clear. The narrator was suffering from severe depression, exacerbated by the trauma of Mark's death. The doctor prescribed medication to help alleviate his symptoms and begin the healing process. While the medication dulled the sharpest edges of his pain, it didn't erase the nightmares or the deep sense of loss that lingered in his heart. The trauma from that weekend in the forest would not simply go away. Seeking further help, the narrator began attending therapy. His sister found a cognitive behavioral therapy program that seemed promising. The therapy was intensive, but it offered the possibility of healing. The therapist suggested that writing about his experiences might help him confront the trauma head-on, forcing him to deal with his emotions instead of burying them. The narrator started writing about Mark's death, the search, the horrors of the forest, and the intense grief that followed. Writing became an outlet, a way to process the overwhelming emotions he had been suppressing for so long. It wasn't easy, and the pain didn't diminish quickly, but the act of putting his feelings into words helped him take small steps toward understanding the depth of his trauma. Despite the therapy, the nightmares didn't cease, and the pain still lingered in his soul. He realized that he would never be the same person again. Mark's death had irrevocably changed him. The scars would never fully heal, and the questions would never be answered. But the narrator was beginning to accept that some things in life would remain a mystery. The past could not be undone, and though the grief would always be a part of him, he had to find a way to live with it. The tragedy would shape his future, but he wasn't sure if it would ever allow him to truly move forward. As time passed, the narrator slowly began to rebuild his life. But he knew that Mark's memory, along with the unanswered questions surrounding his death, would forever remain with him. The darkness that had once threatened to consume him now served as a reminder of the friend he had lost and the unspeakable horror that had forever altered the course of their lives. The narrator's life after the tragic death of his friend Mark was left in ruins. Mark's death, still unsolved, cast a long shadow over everything the narrator did. The brutal nature of the murder decapitation without a clear motive, along with the fact that Mark's head was never found, made it impossible for the narrator to find peace. He couldn't escape the horror that had unfolded during that camping trip. Mark's death had not only taken his friend, but had also taken the narrator's sense of security and stability. In the wake of that tragic event, the narrator spiraled deeper into despair. He was unable to function normally at work or in his personal life. Every day felt like a struggle against the overwhelming grief and confusion that he couldn't shake. Unable to deal with the emotional devastation, the narrator turned to alcohol. At first, it seemed like a way to numb the pain, a brief escape from the constant nightmares and intrusive thoughts. But soon alcohol became the solution to everything. His drinking problem grew worse, and soon he found himself unable to hold down a steady job. Temporary jobs didn't provide the distraction he needed. They only reminded him that he had lost control of his life. The more he drank, the further he distanced himself from reality, and the deeper he sank into depression. As the narrator withdrew further into himself, his relationships deteriorated. His girlfriend, who had been supportive in the beginning, eventually left. The emotional weight of living with someone who couldn't open up and was consumed by grief became too much for her. The narrator understood her decision, but still felt abandoned. Isolated and alone, the narrator became consumed by the memories of that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the woods searching for Mark, finding his body, and feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. The images of Mark's decapitated body, the cold, lifeless form lying on the forest floor, haunted his every thought. His inability to save his friend and the unanswered questions about Mark's death gnawed at him, leaving him with a deep sense of guilt. Why had this happened? What did it all mean? And who was responsible? These questions remained unanswered, and they consumed the narrator, leaving him feeling lost in a world where nothing made sense. The pain grew unbearable. The narrator began to neglect his physical health, stopped eating, and withdrew even further from society. He would sit in his apartment alone in the darkness, staring at the walls and allowing the weight of the world to press down on him. His sister, seeing how far he had fallen, intervened. She took him to see a doctor, and after a series of assessments, he was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety. The doctor prescribed medication to help him manage his symptoms, but it didn't erase the pain. The medication only dulled the edges of the emotional turmoil, but it did little to stop the nightmares or erase the guilt and fear that plagued him. Seeking further help, the narrator began attending therapy. His sister had found a cognitive behavioral therapy CBT program that was intensive but offered a glimmer of hope. The therapist suggested that writing about the traumatic events might help the narrator process his grief and begin to heal. Writing became an outlet, a way to confront the painful memories that he had tried to bury. Though it was difficult and the pain didn't fade quickly, writing allowed the narrator to start making sense of the chaos in his mind. It was a slow and painful process, but each word, each sentence, allowed him to gradually come to terms with his grief. Despite the therapy and medication, the narrator knew that he would never fully heal. The trauma of Mark's death, the unanswered questions, and the sense of loss would always be a part of him. Mark's absence left a gaping hole in the narrator's life, one that couldn't be filled. The nightmare still came, and the memory of that night would never fade. The narrator had come to accept that some things, no matter how hard he tried, would remain beyond his understanding. The mystery of Mark's death would never be solved, and the sense of closure he so desperately needed would never come. As the years went by, the narrator began to rebuild his life, but he could never fully escape the darkness of that camping trip. Mark's memory and the horrifying events that unfolded in the woods would always remain with him. He had moved forward in many ways, but the past was never far behind. The narrator knew that he would carry the weight of that weekend with him for the rest of his life. While he tried to live in the present and build a future, the haunting questions about Mark's death would continue to shadow him. The feeling of helplessness, the fear, and the guilt would never go away, no matter how hard he tried to move on. In the years that followed the traumatic events of that fateful camping trip, the narrator found himself unable to fully escape the haunting memory of Mark's death. The brutal murder, still unsolved and shrouded in mystery, became a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Mark's decapitated body, the eerie silence of the woods, and the unanswered questions left the narrator with a profound sense of loss and confusion. Despite the passage of time, he couldn't shake the deep emotional scars that had formed. The trauma had irrevocably altered the course of his life, leaving him in a constant state of grief and helplessness. Joey, too, struggled to cope with the tragedy, unable to bear the weight of the memories. He moved away, seeking a fresh start in Oregon. The move, though a physical escape from the painful past, did little to ease the emotional burden. The trauma continued to linger in both of their lives, shaping their decisions and their relationships in ways neither of them could have anticipated. For the narrator, the separation from Joey only deepened his sense of isolation. He was left to confront the memories of that weekend alone, and the emotional weight of it all grew heavier with each passing day. Unable to cope with the overwhelming grief, the narrator turned to alcohol as a means of numbing the pain. What had started as an occasional drink became a full-blown addiction as he sought refuge in the bottle to escape the constant nightmares and intrusive thoughts. His drinking spiraled out of control, and soon he found himself unable to hold down a job or function normally in his personal life. His relationships deteriorated, and even his girlfriend, who had once been a source of support, eventually left him. She couldn't bear the emotional turmoil and the walls the narrator had built around himself. He understood her decision, but it left him feeling even more isolated and lost. With the weight of the trauma bearing down on him, the narrator's life became increasingly chaotic. He withdrew from friends, family, and work, unable to find meaning or purpose in anything. The sense of helplessness grew, and it seemed as though nothing could pull him out of the darkness. His days were filled with an endless cycle of self-destruction, and his nights were plagued by nightmares of Mark's lifeless body and the mystery that surrounded his death. The guilt of not being able to protect his friend, coupled with the unanswered questions, consumed the narrator's every waking moment. It wasn't until his sister intervened that the narrator began to seek help. Seeing how far he had fallen, she took him to a doctor, and the diagnosis was clear. The narrator was suffering from severe depression, exacerbated by the trauma of Mark's death. The doctor prescribed medication to help alleviate his symptoms, but it did little to erase the pain or the nightmares. The medication helped dull the sharpest edges of his grief, but it didn't bring him the peace he so desperately needed. The next step in his healing process came when his sister found a cognitive behavioral therapy CBT program. Though intensive, the program offered a glimmer of hope. The therapist encouraged the narrator to confront his trauma head-on and suggested writing about the events as a way of processing the pain. The idea of writing about Mark's death, the search for him in the woods, and the devastating discovery of his body was difficult, but the narrator began to do it. Writing became an outlet for his emotions, allowing him to put his grief into words and begin to make sense of the chaos in his mind. It wasn't an easy process, and the pain didn't fade quickly, but it gave him a sense of agency over his own healing. However, as much as therapy and medication helped the narrator realize that he would never be the same person again, Mark's death had irrevocably altered him, and no amount of therapy or medication could undo the trauma that had shaped his life. The scars, both emotional and mental, would always be a part of him. He had come to terms with the fact that he might never know the answers to the questions that haunted him: why Mark had to die, who had killed him, and where his head had gone. These questions would remain unresolved, and the sense of closure he had once hoped for would never come. The narrator slowly began to rebuild his life, but he knew that he would always carry the weight of that fateful camping trip with him. The memories of Mark and the traumatic events of that weekend would never fully fade, and the questions about his death would linger in the back of his mind. While he learned to live with the grief, the narrator could never forget the darkness that had overtaken his life. Nor could he erase the painful reminder that some things in life remain beyond our understanding. The narrator's life was forever marked by the horrifying and inexplicable death of his friend Mark during a seemingly ordinary camping trip. The memory of that fateful weekend in the woods when Mark's life was cruelly taken from him in such a brutal and mysterious manner continued to haunt the narrator long after the incident. The case remained unsolved, and despite the passage of time, the trauma still lingered, eating away at him. Mark's head was never found, and the unanswered questions about who was responsible and why it happened made it impossible for the narrator to move on. The weight of grief and confusion settled in his mind, creating a constant fog that prevented him from fully processing the horror of the event. Joey, unable to cope with the pain of losing his close friend and the trauma they had shared, decided to leave Cambridge and start over in Oregon. His departure marked the end of an era for both of them. While Joey sought to escape the heavy memories, the narrator stayed behind. But life after Mark's death was never the same. The memories of that weekend haunted him at every turn. He could no longer find comfort in the familiar surroundings of his everyday life. The incident had taken more from him than just a friend. It had stolen his sense of peace, his sense of security, and his ability to function normally. Unable to deal with the emotional weight of his grief, the narrator turned to alcohol. Drinking provided a temporary escape from the relentless nightmares and the emotional toll that came with the memories of that weekend. But alcohol soon became a crutch that he relied on more and more. As his drinking spiraled out of control, the narrator found it increasingly difficult to hold down a job or maintain any kind of stability in his life. He drifted from one temp job to another, unable to focus or find any satisfaction in his work. The emptiness he felt inside could not be filled, and no amount of alcohol or distraction could dull the pain. His relationships with others began to deteriorate as well. His girlfriend, who had stood by him in the aftermath of the tragedy, eventually left him. She couldn't bear the emotional weight of living with someone who was consumed by grief and unable to heal. The narrator understood her decision, but it only deepened his sense of isolation and despair. The sense of helplessness grew as the narrator withdrew from the world around him. His self-destructive behavior intensified, and he found himself retreating further into isolation. His physical health began to suffer as well as he stopped eating and began to lose weight rapidly. His mental health deteriorated, and the sense of hopelessness that consumed him seemed unshakable. The nightmares about Mark's decapitated body continued to plague him, and he found it impossible to escape the trauma that had defined his life. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the woods, searching for his friend, finding his body, and feeling the crushing weight of his own helplessness. It wasn't until his sister intervened that the narrator began to seek help. She took him to a doctor, and after a series of assessments, he was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety. The doctor prescribed medication to help him cope with his symptoms, but it didn't erase the emotional scars or stop the nightmares. The medication helped dull the pain, but the emotional weight remained. Still, the narrator knew that he had to do something to confront the trauma, so he began therapy. His sister had found an intensive cognitive behavioral therapy CBT program, and although it was a long and difficult journey, the narrator began attending sessions twice a week. The therapist encouraged him to write about the traumatic events, to confront his emotions and memories in a way that would allow him to process his grief. Writing became a cathartic outlet, and although it was painful, the act of putting his feelings into words helped him begin to understand the depth of his trauma. It was not a quick fix, and the pain did not fade overnight, but each session brought him closer to acknowledging the grief he had been avoiding. The more he wrote, the more he started to accept that he would never fully recover from the loss of Mark. The trauma had left an indelible mark on him, and the scars would always remain. Despite the progress he made in therapy, the narrator came to the realization that he would never be the same person he was before that camping trip. Mark's death had irrevocably altered him, and no amount of therapy or medication could erase the emotional scars left behind. The mystery of Mark's death would never be solved, and the questions surrounding it would always linger in his mind. The narrator came to terms with the fact that some things in life remain beyond our understanding, and that no matter how hard he tried, he would never have the answers he so desperately sought. The trauma would remain a part of him, but over time he learned to live with it, understanding that healing does not mean forgetting, but rather accepting the past as an inseparable part of who he had become. The camping trip that began as a much-needed getaway soon turned into a nightmare that would haunt the narrator and his friend Joey for the rest of their lives. What was meant to be a simple escape from their everyday struggles quickly became a tragic event, forever changing their perception of safety, trust, and friendship. As the days passed after Mark's brutal and mysterious death, both the narrator and Joey found themselves unable to move on, the trauma from that weekend seeping into every aspect of their lives. The search for Mark, which began with excitement and adventure, had taken a dark turn when Mark disappeared in the middle of the night. What followed was a frantic and terrifying search in the dark, where the narrator and Joey found more than they could ever have imagined. Mark's lifeless body decapitated and left abandoned in the woods. The scene was gruesome and inexplicable. The fact that Mark's head was missing only deepened the mystery, leaving them with more questions than answers. Unable to cope with the magnitude of what had occurred, Joey, like many people dealing with overwhelming grief, sought to escape. He moved away to Oregon, hoping that distance would help him rebuild his life. But even in Oregon, the traumatic memories remained. The pain of losing a close friend in such a violent and unexplained way was too much to bear, and no amount of physical distance could undo the emotional scars. The narrator, on the other hand, stayed behind, but the events of that weekend continued to haunt him, shaping the course of his life in ways he hadn't expected. The narrator found himself consumed by the memories of that night, his search for Mark, the terrifying discovery of his body, and the unanswered questions that followed. He struggled to function in the wake of such a loss. The grief turned into something deeper, a constant weight on his chest that he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mark's decapitated body, and the horror of that image replayed in his mind over and over again. The pain, the confusion, and the guilt of not being able to save his friend weighed heavily on him. What had happened to Mark? Who was responsible for this senseless act? These questions consumed his thoughts, leaving him unable to move forward. To numb the pain, the narrator turned to alcohol, a temporary escape that quickly spiraled out of control. His once vibrant and hopeful life had been replaced by a haze of drinking and self-doubt. He couldn't hold down and his relationships with others deteriorated. His girlfriend, who had tried to support him through the worst of it, eventually left. The emotional burden of being with someone who was so consumed by grief became too much for her. The narrator understood her decision, but it only added to his sense of isolation. As he withdrew further into himself, his physical and mental health deteriorated. The sense of hopelessness grew, and he felt as though he was sinking deeper into a void from which there was no escape. It wasn't until his sister intervened that the narrator sought help. Seeing how far he had fallen, she took him to see a doctor, and he was diagnosed with severe depression, exacerbated by the trauma of Mark's death. The doctor prescribed medication to help him cope with his symptoms, but the pain remained. The medication dulled the edges of his grief, but did nothing to erase the nightmares or the overwhelming sense of loss. The narrator's sister found an intensive cognitive behavioral therapy CBT program, which offered a glimmer of hope. Though it was difficult, the narrator began attending therapy, where he was encouraged to confront his trauma head-on. The therapist suggested writing about the events that had unfolded as a way to process the grief and come to terms with what had happened. Writing about Mark's death, the search for him, and the emotional chaos that followed became a therapeutic outlet. The narrator poured his feelings onto the page, confronting the pain that had been buried for so long. It was a slow and painful process, but over time, the act of writing allowed him to make sense of the chaos in his mind. Despite the progress made through therapy, the narrator realized that he would never be the same person he was before that camping trip. Mark's death had irrevocably altered him, and the scars of that tragedy would remain a part of him forever. While therapy and medication helped him cope, the mystery of Mark's death and the trauma of that weekend would always loom large in his life. The unanswered questions, why Mark had to die in such a brutal manner, who was responsible, and where his head had gone, would never be resolved. The narrator came to terms with the fact that some things are beyond understanding, and the healing process, though necessary, would never erase the past. The eerie events of the camping trip haunted the narrator for years, leaving a permanent scar on his life. What was meant to be a simple escape from the grind of everyday life had turned into a nightmare that would never let him go. The trip, which started with enthusiasm and camaraderie, became the backdrop for a tragedy that none of them could have predicted. Mark's brutal death, decapitated in the middle of the woods, remained an unsolved mystery. The gruesome discovery of Mark's body with his head mysteriously missing sent the narrator and his friend Joey into a spiral of confusion, grief, and fear that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Joey, unable to cope with the unbearable loss and the horror of what happened, eventually made the decision to leave Cambridge. He moved out west to Oregon, hoping that distance from the memories would allow him to rebuild his life. But even the change of location couldn't erase the emotional damage caused by Mark's death. The memories followed him, and the guilt of not being able to protect Mark continued to weigh heavily on his mind. The emotional toll was too much for Joey to handle, and despite the fresh start, he found that the tragedy remained ever present in his life. Meanwhile, the narrator stayed behind, unable to escape the memories that tormented him. He couldn't shake the vision of Mark's decapitated body lying lifeless in the woods. The trauma continued to linger, overshadowing every part of his life. His relationships began to crumble, and his ability to function in normal society deteriorated. He found it increasingly difficult to hold down a job, and his personal life became a mess of confusion and isolation. Friends and family couldn't reach him as he withdrew further and further into himself. He became consumed by the grief of losing Mark and by the unanswered questions surrounding the death. Why had it happened? Who was responsible? Where was Mark's head? These questions were like a constant loop in his mind, and the lack of closure made it impossible for him to move on. Desperate to numb the pain, the narrator turned to alcohol. What started as an occasional drink to take the edge off became a crutch. He relied on more and more. The alcohol provided temporary relief, but it never lasted, and the pain always came back. It wasn't long before his drinking problem spiraled out of control, further complicating his emotional state. He was unable to hold a job, and his relationships with those who cared about him deteriorated. Even his girlfriend, who had been supportive during the initial stages of his grief, eventually left. She couldn't continue living with someone so consumed by the past and so unreachable. The narrator understood her decision, but it left him feeling more alone than ever. His health, both mental and physical, took a toll as well. The trauma from Mark's death affected every part of his life, and the weight of the grief caused him to stop taking care of himself. He stopped eating, lost weight, and found it impossible to get out of bed some days. The nightmares continued, replaying the horror of that night over and over again. The fear of what had happened and the lack of answers kept him trapped in a cycle of despair. The more he tried to numb the pain, the deeper he fell into it. Eventually, his sister intervened. Seeing how far he had fallen, she took him to a doctor where he was diagnosed with severe depression, likely exacerbated by the trauma of Mark's death. The doctor prescribed medication, but while it helped dull the sharp edges of his emotional pain, it didn't erase the deeper wounds. The trauma of that weekend in the woods would never be erased, no matter how much he tried to bury it. In addition to medication, his sister found a cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) program, which he reluctantly agreed to try. The therapist suggested writing about his experience as a way to confront the trauma rather than avoid it. Writing became an outlet for the narrator, a way to release the emotional burden he had been carrying for so long. It was difficult, painful, and slow, but the act of writing allowed him to start processing his grief. Each session, each page written, brought him a little closer to accepting the reality of what had happened. But the narrator realized something painful as he worked through the therapy. No amount of writing therapy or medication would ever completely erase the trauma, Mark's death had irrevocably altered him. The nightmares would continue and the unanswered questions would remain, but he would have to find a way to live with them. The narrator came to terms with the fact that some things, no matter how much he wished for them to be different, would never change. Mark was gone, and he would never have the answers he so desperately sought. All he could do was try to move forward, though the shadow of that night would always remain with him, a constant reminder of the friend he had lost and the horrifying mystery that defined their last camping trip together. The camping trip, which had initially been planned as a peaceful escape into nature, quickly turned into a terrifying ordeal that would haunt the narrator for the rest of his life. He, along with his friends, Craig and Tanner, had set out to enjoy a simple weekend getaway in the backwoods of Tennessee. Their plan was straightforward: set up camp near a secluded lake, enjoy some drinks around a campfire, and unwind from the pressures of their everyday lives. The night started off quietly, and they reveled in the camaraderie of the trip, but the tranquility was shattered the following morning when the narrator found something horrifying on the hood of his truck. It wasn't just a strange abandoned object. It was an animal's skin carefully spread across the truck as though someone had placed it there with intent. The skin was raw and unprocessed, its fur completely removed, leaving only the wet pink underside exposed. The blood streaked down the windshield, dark and dried in places, emanating a stench that seemed to settle in the air, filling the narrator's senses with unease. At first, he tried to rationalize it, wondering if it was just some prank or the work of a hunter, but the horror of the situation was undeniable. The lack of animal legs and head, the jagged cuts, and the almost deliberate placement of the skin made the sight all the more unsettling. Craig and Tanner were just as shocked when they emerged from the tent, their faces paling as they saw the gruesome scene before them. They didn't need to speak much. They knew something was terribly wrong. The three friends acted quickly, tearing down the camp and abandoning the area in a state of panic. But even as they piled their belongings into the truck and drove away, the sense of dread lingered. The woods, once a peaceful retreat, now felt ominous and oppressive. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond their vision, never left them as they drove back. The encounter with the skinned animal stayed with them long after they left the campsite. The narrator's attempt to find some logical explanation, like a sick joke or a freak accident, fell apart as he spoke to locals about similar incidents. Mr. Harris, a man at the local gas station, mentioned hearing stories of people finding skinned animals left in strange places in the deep woods, often as warnings to outsiders or trespassers. The more the narrator learned, the more the sense of unease grew. The fear of something darker, something that lurked in the woods, consumed him. The fear didn't subside when he returned home. The narrator became obsessed with finding answers, scouring online forums for any other accounts of similar experiences. The more he read, the more the story seemed to repeat itself. People spoke of strange encounters with skinned animals, mysterious figures in the woods, in an eerie presence that seemed to follow them home. The skin on the truck, once dismissed as a prank, now seemed like part of a much larger, more sinister pattern. The narrator couldn't escape the thought that what they had found wasn't just a random act, but part of something darker, a warning they had failed to heed. Months passed, but the narrator couldn't shake the feeling of something watching him. He kept his truck locked at all times and became paranoid about venturing too far into the woods again. Craig and Tanner, too, felt the weight of what had happened, though they never spoke of it again. The fear had settled deep within them, an unspoken agreement that they would never return to that spot, and perhaps never go back into the woods at all. The skinned animal on the hood of the truck wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a sign that they had stumbled upon something that they were never meant to understand. The trip meant to be an escape had left them marked. While the events seemed like a bizarre or unsettling chapter in their lives, the truth was that something far more sinister had been at play. The encounter with the skinned animal left them with more questions than answers, and no matter how hard they tried to rationalize it, they knew deep down that it was something that would forever change their perspective on the woods and the world around them. The sense of dread and the haunting memories would stay with them, unresolved and unanswered for the rest of their lives.